The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I'm your host, Len Bier. My guest today is Cathy Day. She is the Climate Policy Coordinator for the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. Cathy Day has worked on agriculture and climate change for most of the last 20 years. Before joining NSAC, she taught in the Environmental Science and Studies and Sustainable Food Systems programs at Stetson University, where she also led implementation of the Sustainable Farming Fund. She holds a Ph.D. and M.S. in geography from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she researched how Nigerian and New Mexican farmers respond to multiple stressors, including climate change. Raised in Montana, her background includes time as a farm apprentice in Alaska, as an agricultural extension agent with the Peace Corps in Niger, and as an agricultural educator in New York, New Mexico, and Florida. She earned her B.A. in Environmental Studies and French at the University of Kansas. She studied in the CAL's Crop and Soil Science program as a master's student at Cornell University before earning a M.A.T. and a biology teaching certificate. Cathy Day, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Thanks so much, Len. Glad to be here.
There's so many terms in use these days. You know, everyone's heard organic agriculture, sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, permaculture. Could you tell us how your organization defines sustainable agriculture?
Absolutely, yeah. So it encompasses all of those other terms that you named, and sustainable agriculture is actually defined in U.S. code. So it's defined as an integrated system of plant and animal production practices that have a site-specific application over the long term that help with human food and fiber needs, but also advance and enhance environmental quality and the natural resource base, make the most efficient use of non-renewable resources possible, sustain the economic viability of farms, and enhance the quality of life for farmers and society as a whole. So it's really a holistic definition of what farming should look like.
Wow, and if farming looked like that, and especially broadly, that's a lot of values to incorporate into it. How do those practices differ from most agricultural practice in the U.S. today?
Yeah, that's a really great and complicated question. Most of agriculture is making some strides toward things like reducing soil erosion and loss, improving water quality, that kind of general improvement in their systems. But at the same time, most of those sustainable systems of practice that are the kinds of things we really want to be moving toward are going to go much further. They're going to move toward having net zero or better soil erosion, for example, by building effective, really biologically rich soils and keeping them in place by doing things like putting living roots in the ground all year long, which means you have to have something, whether it's a crop, a cover crop, a perennial crop, on the ground all year long. And they're also going to be doing things like integrating perennials into the system. So that means that they're putting in deep roots. They're putting something that always keeps the soil covered. They're putting things that allow them to have a harvest, for example, perennial tree crops, perennial shrub crops, without having to till the soil and reduce a lot of the soil carbon sequestration that happens. So all of these systems, those pieces are going to be important, but they also should be doing things like reducing their fossil fuel use. And they can do things like that by working toward elimination of synthetic fertilizers and synthetic pesticides and drastically reducing the tillage of their soils. And they also, at the same time, can improve their water quality as they are creating soil and plant systems that effectively absorb and filter water. So that's kind of combined goals throughout all of this. And all of this is with the broader goal that they are supporting the human system as well. So that means supporting the farm owner themselves, supporting the farm laborers, supporting the community as well. So
Wow.
really high quality systems have some pretty high level goals, but even the best systems still have a lot of way to go, partly because we don't have the best system of economic supports for those small and medium scale farmers right now.
Right. And I've heard statistics thrown around about how much agriculture contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, and there's seems to be a spectrum of what people are saying that contribution is. Can you give us an idea of how significant that contribution is in terms of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture?
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, it depends a little bit how you count. And there is an international system of counting that the Environmental Protection Agency uses. It's, internationally agreed upon, but it leaves out a lot of existing agricultural emissions. So it counts the things that happen really on the farm very directly. And what doesn't get counted in that on-farm number, that's somewhere in the 10% or so of greenhouse gas emissions in the US range. It's not counting the production of fertilizers, the production of pesticides. It's not counting on-farm energy use. And one big piece is it's not counting the historical emissions that resulted from plowing up the land in the first place, and that we haven't really gone very far toward recovering by ensuring that we have that permanent cover of the soil with living plant tissue all year. And then there's a whole piece of after it leaves the farm, the broader food system of processing, storage, and transport. That is also not counted in that EPA number. So it does give us a good idea of how the farm on farm compares to the rest of the economy by saying, okay, about 10% of the economy's greenhouse gas emissions come from on the farm. But it doesn't count many of the things that are associated with agriculture that also matter, that probably would raise that percentage by about 50%.
Wow. Okay, that really helps get a sense of why I see different figures from different sources. And I just have to throw this in as a transportation geek. The same thing happens in transportation. When we talk about automobile contribution to greenhouse gases, they are looking at tailpipe emissions and, to some extent, power plant emissions for electric vehicles. But they don't count all the carbon emissions associated with production of asphalt and concrete for pavement. They don't count all the energy that goes into operating all the things that make an automobile system of transportation possible, which is, everything from, clearing roadways and constructing roadways, gas stations and their operation, mechanics shops and their operations, automobile factories and their operations. None of that's counted when they say how much automobiles, are responsible for climate change. So, how vulnerable is agriculture to the consequences of global warming?
Yeah, that's also an excellent question, because just as agriculture is a fairly significant contributor to climate change, it's also extremely vulnerable to it. And, the best way, I think, to get some understanding of that is to hear some of the examples we've heard from around the country. This is just examples that I've heard over the past year and talking with farmers through the work that I do. And for example, I spoke with some farmers in Northern California who were seed crop growers. They grew vegetable seeds and other kinds of seeds. And they lost the substantial majority of multiple crops because of wildfire smoke, because that lingering wildfire smoke in the air prevented their crops from getting sufficient sunlight. And so they just simply never got a good seed crop out of that, which meant a big proportion of their income was lost that year. You can look at other examples with freezes. We have these strange freeze cycles that are happening that are different from what people have historically experienced, that are partly a result of what's changing with the way that air circulation happens around the poles. And so we get farmers in Georgia losing their blueberries because of freezes that affect the flowering of the blueberries. And then we get, on the other hand, people who are dealing with water shortages. So there's a farmer I talked with last year who was losing her farm because the water sources they had on their farm had simply dried up. And then at the other end of that spectrum, we have folks who write to us asking about how they can go about getting assistance because they've experienced multiple 100-year floods in a period of just a few years. And so they've had huge losses across their land, parts of their infrastructure washed away, their crops washed away, or other, material that supports their cropland if the floods are happening outside of the production season. All of those are having huge impacts on people's well-being as well as on their farm income. And then, of course, throughout the West, as you all in California are pretty familiar, there's just so much intense drought alternating with these flood cycles. So people are really dealing with this long-term trend of aridification. It's been dry for 20 years in parts of the West, and that's starting to really shift what people are able to do in their agricultural production. So all of those have big impacts on our food production, and they have big impacts on farm income and what farmers are able to do going forward.
Yeah, it's very dramatic how devastating those changes can be, and it does come down to food. Like it affects what's available and how much is available and at what price for us to eat, which kind of brings us back to the fundamentals of why agriculture is so important. Your organization's mission statement states that the National Sustainable Agricultural Coalition is an alliance of grassroots organizations that advocates for federal policy reform to advance the sustainability of agriculture, food systems, natural resources, and rural communities. Could you describe the organization's structure and the activities you're engaged in?
Sure. So as a coalition, and we say NSAC for short, so NSAC is a group of more than 130 food and farm organizations around the country. And so our coalition members work on a daily basis with farmers, with farm workers, and with others who work on the front lines of the food system, including places like local foods in the farmers markets. And in DC, we have our small staff of DC focused members who we're talking here to Congress and to federal agencies like the USDA, and we're advocating for the needs of those sustainable farmers across the country. And the way that we do that is by listening to what our members say. So our members come to us, we have conversations on a monthly basis in what are called issue committees. I, for example, work with the Climate Change Subcommittee, and the Climate Change Subcommittee talks about climate issues in agriculture and what our policies should be and how we should advocate for them. And so that is made up of between 20 and 30 member organization staffers. They come and talk with me every month, and on an annual basis, we develop a list of priorities. And those are the things that we take to Congress every year and ask for. And in this case, since it is a Farm Bill year, we're actually looking for building those priorities into the 2023 Farm Bill. And so that's a lot of the focus on climate and agriculture that we've been talking about. It's going to be addressed through the priorities of what members and I have talked about over the past 18 months or so.
Yeah. Do you actually draft legislation for Congress members, or do you simply just try to get them educated on the issues?
We do some legislative drafting. A lot of it is drafted in collaboration with members of Congress staff, but also there's a certain amount of drafting that NSAC does itself. A lot of what we do is more focused on advocacy, but we have a tradition, unlike many other advocacy organizations in agriculture, of actually doing some legislative drafting here at NSAC.
Wow. That sounds like a really high level of policy work. What's at the top of your agenda right now in terms of federal agricultural policy?
Yeah, we have a whole suite of things that are focused on addressing climate change as well as improvements to the broader food and farm system. And one I'll mention up front that often comes out when we're thinking about climate change is crop insurance. So we have a focus this year on trying to ensure that the federal crop insurance system meets the needs of small and diversified growers, because currently the federal crop insurance system has a system called the Whole Farm Revenue Protection Program, but it's not very well supported by the existing public-private partnership where the risk management agency works with insurance agencies. And so that particular program needs a lot more robust support from the government so that farmers will be able to access it. And why that's important is that's the one program that really meets the needs of diversified growers, because most of the crop insurance programs focus on simple commodity crop production. And so there is a real need for supporting those sustainable farmers through the crop insurance system. But beyond that, we also have a big focus on putting climate at the forefront in the agricultural conservation programs, especially the Conservation Stewardship Program, which has long been an important one for us. We have a desire to put more focus on climate in the research, extension, and education program as well, including putting some focus on getting better bred seeds and breeds, which means better plant options and better animal livestock options for people to use as they're adapting to climate change. So we're part of the work on a bill that would build more robust education and research support for better seed and breed work. And then we're also looking at building out the local food system. So reinforcing those systems that support people with direct local food access, as well as ensuring that food processing, especially meat and poultry processing, meet the needs of small and mid-scale farmers. So a lot of people will remember that in the pandemic, we saw a lot of problems with the meat processing system, that it did not respond well to strain. And that's partly because it has very few facilities that effectively serve those with smaller farm and ranch operations. So smaller farmers, they're often those who are employing the more advanced grazing techniques that are really vital for sequestering soil carbon and fighting climate change. So they need meat processing facilities that meet their needs, and the large-scale meat processing facilities where they often have to transport their animals a long distance and they can only respond to whatever price they are offered really don't meet the needs of those small and mid-scale livestock producers. And then another piece of all of this is ensuring access to land for all farmers. So land prices are high right now throughout the country, and credit is hard to access for many farmers, especially if they're beginning farmers, if they are farmers of color. The systems are simply not particularly friendly to them. And so it's important that we ensure that all farmers who want to farm have access to land and that they can get the credit that they need to employ the conservation programs, for example, that they could be putting into place on their farms. And traditionally, they've had a very difficult time accessing the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the Farm Service Agency. For one, because of really strong historical discrimination that has occurred within those agencies, and that USDA has really been working hard to rectify under this administration, but still has a lot of remaining challenges. And also because there is a perception in those agencies that if you are a small producer, say somebody with an acre of land, you have a diversified vegetable operation on that acre, that you are not a farmer, that you're a gardener. And they don't understand that, well, yes, you may have $100,000 of income, but oh, wait, you're still a gardener. So it takes a lot of explanation for them to understand those diversified operations oftentimes. And so those kinds of farmers don't always get access to what they need from the agencies.
Yeah, it sounds like they're geared much more towards the monocrop large operations than to people who are growing at more of a community scale.
Absolutely, yes.
If you're just tuning in, my guest is Cathy Day. She is the Climate Policy Coordinator for the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, or NSAC. And Cathy, I know there's a piece of legislation recently introduced. I believe it's called the Agriculture Resilience Act. What would that? Are some of the policies you've talked about that you're working on, are those incorporated within that?
Yes, some of them are. So A lot of what we're advocating for is built into the Agricultural Resilience Act, and it covers a whole spectrum of things across the Farm Bill. So it addresses changes in the conservation programs, for example, and that one's particularly important. And those few who may be familiar with what the Inflation Reduction Act did for the conservation programs may say, well, we already have some effective policy that's covering increases to the conservation stewardship and the environmental quality incentives program, for example. But the reality is that the Inflation Reduction Act essentially just made up for losses, and particular losses to the conservation stewardship program in the 2014 and 2018 farm bills, because through a variety of means, the conservation stewardship lost a fairly significant proportion of its funding in those two programs. So the Inflation Reduction Act replace that funding. And also the Inflation Reduction Act really did one thing in terms of policy. Aside from making funding, it created a separate program within each of those programs that focuses on greenhouse gas mitigation, but only on greenhouse gas mitigation. It does not focus on creating more resilient systems. And we'll talk about this. There's a lot of overlap between mitigation and resilience, but it's not 100% overlap. And there's also a different mindset that comes about when you focus exclusively on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So the policies that we're advocating for in the Conservation Stewardship Program and Environmental Quality Incentives Program, for one, they would make permanent increases to those programs. The Inflation Reduction Act only created a 10-year program, so it's temporary, and we want to see permanent increases to those programs, because right now, so the Conservation Stewardship Program we often call CSP, and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program EQIP. So CSP and EQIP are really oversubscribed. And what I mean by that is that in many states, 3 to 4 times as many farmers apply for those programs as are able to receive funds. So that means there are a lot of farmers who really want to do some great conservation work, but they're not getting the money that they need to do it. So we want to see permanent funding increase to help meet that need, but we also want to see some careful changes within CSP and EQIP so that the programs are more permanently focused on a holistic approach to improving the approach of farmers to greenhouse gas emissions reductions and to resilience, so that they're able to effectively move into the future with farms that will meet climate challenges. Beyond that set of approaches, that also includes a state-specific program that would be new and work alongside CSP and EQIP. The bill includes a focus on research in climate change, and that essentially creates a research focus across all of the USDA research programs that doesn't currently exist. And it also does some particularly significant changes within the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program. That is a farmer-driven research program where farmers actually get to decide on the research, carry out the research. They get to work side by side with university researchers to implement what works for them on their farms. So this would create a new climate-focused program where farmers get some additional funds to work on climate-focused research. And then similarly, the climate hubs that already exist would get some more permanent focus from this bill, and the long-term agroecosystem research network as well. And both of those are really important because they give a long-term and climate-focused permanent set of funding for work that helps us to understand how change happens over the longer term. So we know that a lot of the benefits that we see from sustainable systems take a long time to come to fruition. It might take 5 to 7 years to put in place initially to really start getting an economic benefit. And then you may start to see over 10, 20, 30 years a big difference when you compare a system that is using tillage or is using pesticides to a system that is not using substantial tillage or has reduced or eliminated pesticides. And so the long-term agroecosystem research network does a lot of those side-by-side comparisons over the long term. And so it's really important for understanding what is actually the best version of a sustainable system. And so that's part of what the bill addresses, is making those kinds of programs more permanently supported in the Farm Bill.
Wow.
And then beyond that,
I mean, unless you understand the nature of the problem, what you try to do to address the problem may not really work. So it seems like that kind of information is just sort of fundamental to any of this.
Absolutely, yes. It's all very important to making sure that we're choosing the best systems that we possibly can. And it's something that the Inflation Reduction Act originally was going to do, but when a lot of cuts happened back in the fall last year, when in the final version of the act, there wasn't any more focus on research in agriculture. And there are a few other pieces of the Agricultural Resilience Act, including some important pieces that address livestock challenges, that address meat processing challenges that we've talked about. Rural energy is another piece, so ensuring that there are some increases in focus of the Rural Energy for America program to allow it to have a very specific focus on greenhouse gas mitigation. And that is a program that focuses on renewable energy and on energy conservation on the farm. And there are also some pieces that focus on composting and food waste reduction, so kind of address the other end of the system. When we're sending a lot of our waste from our households, from our stores, we're sending it out to landfills where it turns into methane. And so addressing those pieces not only helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but then can result in, instead of having waste, we can have a resource that farmers can use back on the farm to build their soil quality over time.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, closing the circle on all of those resource uses.
Exactly.
Well, that seems like a really comprehensive approach. And I understand, I believe there's both a House and a Senate version of the bill at this point.
There is, yes.
And we hear a lot, the pundits are always talking about, the rural-urban divide and all that sort of thing. It seems like virtually every rural congressional district has agriculture of some form going on in it. And a lot of the urban congressional districts are represented by politicians who tend to be more interested in taking action on climate change issues. So how does the prospect for support for legislation like this sort of filter through all those perceptions and self-perceptions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we know that almost every farm bill has a certain amount of regional tug of war. Different regions tend to have their certain priorities over time. And the West versus the East have different priorities. We're certainly seeing that in regard to climate change, as the East is a little bit more focused on greenhouse gas mitigation in agriculture. The West is very concerned about drought and so wants to focus on ensuring that the system is resilient to drought in the longer term. And if we put those together through the lens of the Agricultural Resilience Act, it's really focusing on both of those simultaneously. And there have been some changes in the Act in this latest version that focus explicitly on the drought in the West, for example. But we're seeing a lot of the supporters for sustainable action in the Farm Bill are people who kind of bridge the rural-urban divide. They're people who are just intimately aware of what agriculture needs to do going into the future. For example, the original sponsor of the Agricultural Resilience Act, Shelley Pingree, is herself a farmer in Maine, a longtime organic farmer. And so she has a lot of experience with what farming needs to do to respond effectively to climate change. And that's where this bill came from, was her really caring about ensuring that farmers had the tools that they need going into the future. So this is a very farmer-driven climate approach.
Wow, that's amazing and terrific. We're going to take a really short break. We'll be right back with Cathy Day of the National Sustainable Agriculture. I got to learn to say that. The National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. Right after this. Don't go away. Welcome back to Talk of the Bay on KSQD. If you're just joining us, my guest is Cathy Day. She is the Climate Policy Coordinator for the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. And we've been talking about, the issues of sustainable agriculture in the broader sense, and also about federal legislation and how that affects farmers and agriculture in the country. One of the things we hear about a lot in sustainable agriculture is living cover and perennial production systems. And I wondered if you could explain that a little bit.
Yeah. So when we talk about perennial living cover, we can be talking about a lot of different kinds of plants. So we might be talking about, in some cases, there are systems where farmers are putting in place relay crops. So they might plant, for example, a small grain crop during the winter that helps to keep the system soil covered and helps to ensure that they're maintaining the nutrition in the soil that was there from last year's fertilizer or from last year's maybe clover crop. So if you put in next or before you've put in a clover crop, that's going to put nitrogen into your system, and that's going to maintain the levels of nitrogen that you need for another crop. So maybe after your small grain crop, you might be putting in corn. And so that relay cropping system ensures that you're planting one thing into another. So there's always something that's alive on the ground. That reduces erosion. And that's the starting point for reducing the loss of greenhouse gases, because if we keep the soils in place, there's a lot less potential for carbon dioxide and nitrogen to be lost from the soil. But that can also take a lot of other different forms. So it could be by having a perennial crop. For example, a perennial grain crop like kernza can stay in place over a series of years. And since it stays in place longer, it grows some nice deep roots. It grows a lot of what we call biomass below ground as well as above ground. And that helps to keep the soil in place. It also, with those deep roots, is going to sequester carbon more deeply in the soil. And that's important because the deeper the carbon is in the soil, the less likelihood it could be removed through plowing. And so perennial grain crops and perennial pastures are a couple of great ways to increase our ability to sequester carbon in the soils. And then you can also add into the system agroforestry systems. And those look like a variety of things. So it might be somebody growing rows of tree crops, and in between growing rows of annual crops. It could be grain crops or vegetable crops, for example. There are also other agroforestry systems that use livestock. So we call those silvopasture systems. And silvopasture systems are combinations of tree and livestock that usually have some kind of pasture underneath the trees. And those are also extremely beneficial because you get, again, those deep-rooted grasses, those deep-rooted trees, all of those sequestering carbon. And at the same time, the livestock and their waste are ending up incorporated back into the soil and enriching the pasture and the trees and helping them to produce their crops more effectively. So all of those are different ways of keeping the soil covered all through the year. And the deeper the roots, generally speaking, the better. The more permanent, the better. Having a little bit of very mild tillage once in a while seems to be somewhat beneficial for sequestering carbon from what we found, but you really want to limit tillage because when you till soil, as far as climate change is concerned, you are releasing greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And so having that living root in the soil throughout the year is not only a protection against losing that greenhouse gas, but it's also a way to sequester carbon. So it's really a combined system with a variety of different options that helps to ensure that we're using agriculture as a tool to reduce our overall greenhouse gas emissions.
And it seems like a lot of this is really informed by, I'll call it, fairly modern science. I've had the opportunity to witness more or less indigenous agricultural practices. Like in the highlands of Guatemala, they do a lot of burning. Like they'll grow their corn crop, often interplanted with beans and other plants, typically as border plants. And then when their harvest is done, they'll actually burn the field. And of course, that the ash provides a certain amount of fertilizing benefit. But I don't know, how that affects the soil itself. And then in places I've seen also in the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, grain farmers, have hillsides that have been terraced for, well over a millennia for growing grain. And they simply just let the stubble, decay into the soil after they harvest. And Are the methods you're talking about in these kinds of perennial production systems, or the interplanting of trees and pasture and that kind of thing, are there examples of that in traditional, historical agriculture?
Absolutely. Yeah. What we generally say these days is that all of these really sustainable practices have indigenous roots, that people have been practicing most of them somewhere in the world for millennia. And to take the example of the highlands in Guatemala, a lot of those systems are they're the existing, continuing heritage of what the Maya have done for thousands of years themselves. So those milpa systems, they traditionally, before the advent of European colonial ideas about how agriculture should be carried out, those systems were 30-year rotations where the fields would be burned, and then over a series of 30 years, they would plant annual crops and slowly allow perennial crops to move more and more into the space. Bananas and papayas and other kinds of perennial crops would slowly take over. And at the end of 30 years, they would have a nice, mature food forest that they were working from. And then they would come back to that piece of land and start the cycle afresh. So they would move from parcel to parcel of land, and they would have a different stage of agricultural production at a different time. There's still some folks that practice that kind of milpa system in a fairly similar way, and it's a very sustainable kind of system. It's gotten a lot of flack because of the burning. Europeans perceived it when they arrived as being, and for a long time since I should add, as being damaging. But the fact is that effective, carefully managed burning is good for the soil and good for the system over the longer term.
Yeah, interesting. And we know that that's, for example, the California natural habitat is very highly adapted to fire. And we've been suppressing fire for the last 150 or so years. And now we're realizing that that's not such a good strategy in this climate, particularly and with this community of plants. So it seems like there's a lot to learn from indigenous practice. There's a lot of talk these days about the greenhouse gas emissions from livestock production. And is there anything in proposed federal legislation that would address that?
Yeah. So the Agriculture Resilience Act addresses that in a number of ways, for example. And one of those ways is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP. As it currently sits, EQIP has a 50% livestock set aside. So what that means is that half of the EQIP funds are designated to go towards some kind of livestock payments, whether it's for concentrated animal feeding operations to build a new reservoir for liquid manure, or for them to build a facility for processing livestock that is waste livestock that they're not able to use because it's diseased. A lot of those funds go toward those sorts of uses. And what the Agriculture Resilience Act does is take that 50% and target 2/3 of it specifically toward grazing practices. So that would remove a lot of those funds from usage for those systems that are associated with a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, with a lot of pollution concerns for fence line communities, those especially communities of color who tend to live close to livestock facilities, and would move the funding predominantly instead towards systems that are more environmentally beneficial for people, as well as for greenhouse gas emissions reductions and increased resilience. And so that livestock set aside would be an important shift. But in addition to that, there are a number of other pieces in the Agriculture Resilience Act that address that. So, for example, the Grazing Lands Conservation Initiative is a long-standing element of federal legislation, but that went underfunded for a couple of decades, essentially, and just started to get some appropriated funding last year. And so that is getting some reinvigorated support, and that is an education program for people who want to build advanced pasture-based systems that are really responsive to the needs of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, of increasing the resilience of the farm, increasing the economic benefit of the farm. And so Grazing Lands Conservation Initiative is a great education initiative for helping people to shift broad scale towards those grazing systems. And that could, for example, folks could use both the Grazing Lands Conservation Initiative and that EQIP livestock set-aside money to do some new work on their land to move toward pasture-based systems. And then if we think about the systems like dairies, for example, where there's a lot of manure that ends up in manure lagoons, and manure lagoons are a known source of a lot of greenhouse methane. And so one of the elements of the Agricultural Resilience Act is called the Alternative Manure Management Program, actually inspired by a California program. And that program would help farmers to shift from wet manure management and its high greenhouse emissions toward dry manure management and composting, so that it's still a system for creating some effective reuse of that waste, so it's no longer waste but a resource, but does it in a much lower greenhouse gas emissions method and much lower cost, because a lot of the ways that have been proposed for dealing with methane emissions around manure lagoons have been methane digesters and anaerobic energy production. And that, puts a Band-Aid on a problematic system, but it still produces a lot of greenhouse gases, for one, in part because although you contain the gases from that manure lagoon, you don't reduce greenhouse gas emissions from producing large-scale monoculture corn and soy, and from raising livestock in confined operations and so forth. So the alternative manure management program would help people to shift toward those more pasture-based kinds of systems and make it easier for people to deal with manure in a way that's lower emissions. There's still a couple of other programs too. There's quite a bit that addresses livestock in the Act. So Grasslands 30 is one. That's part of the Conservation Reserve Program. And that piece of the Conservation Reserve Program works with existing grasslands that can be used for grazing, with the focus more on protecting the land than on the grazing, but it allows for continued grazing. And Grasslands 30 would allow for people, when that land that's currently under 10 or 15-year contracts to expire, that land that's protected as grassland that's used for some grazing, that land can then go into new 30-year contracts. So it gets some more permanent land set aside that's protected and that is going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions because it won't be plowed up for that entire 30 years. So all those carbon dioxide emissions that it would otherwise have will be reduced, and the carbon dioxide kept in place over the longer term. And then I also mentioned earlier the processing resilience piece of the Act, and that's an important one for ensuring that farmers who do those kinds of methods actually have a way to process their meat and reach consumers more directly.
Yeah. There's so much involved in all of that. I guess legislatively it would be impossible to ensure that everything, all the range management is done perfectly, et cetera, but at least in providing support and education around those issues, that, there's going to be improvement. We know that much. So
exactly, yeah.
That's amazing. There's been a significant loss of cropland nationwide over the past probably 80 years, 100 years. I don't really know the figure, but certainly in the last 50 years, it's been very measurable. At the same time, there's an increasing concentration of ownership of farmland. Is there any legislation that would affect any of that?
Yes, in the Agricultural Resilience Act, there is there are some elements, I should say, that help with that concentration of ownership issue, and particularly the Farmland Protection Policy Act is strengthened through the Agricultural Resilience Act, and that is a piece of legislation that helps reduce the conversion of farmland to non-farm uses. And the more we keep farmland in place rather than converting it to urban or other uses, the lower land prices can stay. And so that's an important element to ensure that it's strong, robust going into the future. There are other pieces of legislation that others are working on. The National Young Farmers Coalition, for example, is working on ensuring effective land access through a number of means. And here at NSAC, we're working on ensuring that folks have adequate credit to access land as well. And that's a big piece of the puzzle, is making sure that the farm credit systems through which a lot of people are going to access land are not just robust and well funded, but they're also accessible to people who are interested in getting into farming. Because as I mentioned a while back, beginning and farmers of color both tend to have a lot of trouble accessing those systems. And so we're building in some robust outreach and education, and connecting the Farm Service Agency with those kinds of farmers is going to be really important to ensuring that they have good access to credit going forward, so that there's some strong relationships there in addition to improved funding and improved access to the programs.
That's great. If you're just tuning in, my guest is Cathy Day. She is the Climate Policy Coordinator for the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, or NSAC. Cathy, the EPA is offering climate pollution reduction grants right now. Can you tell us a little about that program?
I can, yes. My colleague Jeannie Merrill, who is working out of California, is helping us with some work on that. But generally speaking, what the program does is states and municipalities will receive funding to reduce their emissions. And the programming generally will focus on the 3 largest municipalities in each state, but every state has the opportunity to sign on to that. And right now they're getting some initial sign-on so that they can get support to do planning. And ideally what that planning is going to look like is that all of those, the states and the municipalities that get the focused funding, are going to be thinking about all the ways in which they can reduce their greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors. And so, that can take a variety of different forms, of course. That's going to look like people thinking in depth about their transportation systems, like you could no doubt talk about, but it's also going to be an opportunity for things like urban agriculture, because there has been an increasing excitement and implementation of urban agriculture throughout a lot of the largest cities in the country, as well as many smaller ones. And getting some funding for people to think about where they can place permanent urban food forests, community farms, community garden operations, all of those kinds of things could be well supported if the cities that are getting involved include that kind of work in their plan. And so this is an opportunity for a lot of us to be getting involved with talking to the EPA in our regions and telling them what we think is most important to work on in our own states. And there's actually, if you go to our blog, there's a post there about the climate pollution reduction grant system, and it can tell you all about who you need to go to talk to in your state, because it will vary by state. Different states are having different entities. Sometimes new organizations are being made, and sometimes it's an existing state structure that's addressing these grants. And so you can talk in your own state to the folks that are working on this and try to find out if there are ways that you can help to implement some urban ag initiatives within your area by effectively planning through these EPA grants. It's the biggest set of climate funding that's out there, so it's an important one for people to take advantage of.
Yeah, that's amazing, and they're giving money to every state and to the largest metropolitan areas as well. And I noted as it's written, as it's described, that if a state decides not to take their share, then cities within the state can go after the state's share, which, I can imagine certain states, the legislature would simply say, oh, we don't believe in that, we're not going to do it. But there could be cities within the state that say, well, fine, we'll use that money. We know exactly what to do with it. So it's an interesting era in which to try to produce policy that is fairly distributed and effective. Another pending piece of legislation is the Farmers Market and Food Bank Local Revitalization Act. What would that act provide?
Yeah, so that's one that my colleague Hannah works on. And that includes a number of essential investments in local and regional food systems. And the idea is that we work on strengthening the connections between local farmers and local eaters. And part of that is because when we strengthen those connections, we also support public health and we help to support local economies. So some of the specifics are that the bill would propose increasing funding for the Senior Farmers Market Nutrition Program, and that provides low-income seniors with access to locally grown food. It also increases the Women, Infants, and Children Farmers Market Nutrition Program on the individual benefit level, and it increases overall funding spent with local farmers. So all of that helps to ensure not only that farmers who are small and sustainable are getting the funds that they need, but that people in the community who tend to be most vulnerable have more effective access to fresh, locally grown produce that's really healthy. And then it also goes a little further. So it encourages new and existing markets by offering resources to update and establish farmers markets through a new infrastructure funding program. And it creates a new Department of Agriculture pilot program for food banks to procure produce from local growers. And that's been a big emphasis within the local food system over the past few years from our perspective, is trying to ensure that local entities have the opportunity to procure, that's the word I have trouble with, procure produce from local growers, sustainable growers, organic growers, that they have the opportunity to define where they want their food to come from and what the food, the qualities around that food should look like. And so that's been a big push, and increasingly through some of the administrative action that that staffer has been taking, we've been getting some improvements in the ability of all of those, schools and senior centers and that sort of thing to procure produce that is in line with their values. So it's been a good shift, and we'd like to continue to see that with the Farm Bill.
Yeah, and I know historically a lot of food banks have been limited to, dry goods and the usual, you think of canned food and, bags of flour and rice. We have a local food bank here, Second Harvest Food Bank, that has been working to get fresh produce into their distribution since their beginnings some 50 years ago now. So, but I think they're somewhat unique in that, or at least early starters in that effort. So it's critically important that people who don't have the means to provide enough food for their households still have access to healthy, fresh food, as well as all the processed and preserved food. So that's an amazing improvement. For most of us, the closest we might get to lobbying is, maybe writing a letter to our local Congress member or meeting with them at their local office. Are you actively involved in lobbying in D.C., and what's it like?
Yeah, that is a lot of my job description, is to advocate directly with members of Congress as well as with congressional or with executive agencies. And so I spend a lot of time talking to the staffers of members of Congress. And it is, as I came into this just a couple of years ago, it has been a surprisingly good experience, because there are so many smart and dedicated, often relatively young people who are the staffers for members of Congress. Oftentimes, these are people who are really interested in making the world a better place and in taking their education and turning it into an opportunity to improve our laws and improve, in this case, the future of the Farm Bill for the United States, so that we have a better focus on sustainable systems. So it's really great to get to talk with a lot of them, and sometimes we have different ideas about what constitutes the best set of improvements to have, and that's a conversation. And sometimes there are offices that we simply can't come to agreement with. But generally speaking, there are a lot of really dedicated people on Capitol Hill who are staffing those congressional offices and who are really excited about doing their best to make the world a better place.
That's good to hear. Well, we just have a couple minutes left, and I want to invite you to tell us how listeners can get involved in supporting sustainable agriculture and helping to promote the legislation that facilitates progress on these issues.
Yeah. So one of the things you can do is that the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition maintains a list that you can subscribe to. So if you go to our website, sustainableagriculture.net, and find subscribe, so you can also go to sustainableagriculture.net/subscribe to find that, you can stay up to date with our newsletters. And when there's a big update about something that's coming out, for example, when the Agriculture Resilience Act was reintroduced in Congress last week, we sent out an update about that. And there will be opportunities to take action that come out of that. So you may have, you'll see that there's an opportunity to use some language to either call into the switchboard for your member of Congress or to write a letter and to advocate for the Agriculture Resilience Act and make them understand that it's a priority for you in your state or in your particular congressional district to take action on the Farm Bill. And you can also stay up to date with what's on our blog. We have regular blog posts, and weekly we send out an update of what's come out on our blog. And if you're on the list, you'll get those weekly updates. And lots of other ways throughout our website to focus on taking action. But if you work directly in agriculture or even in gardening, I encourage you to get out and talk to your local people, your state level agriculture folks. Those people should be hearing from you and know what you think is important and what your needs are. If they're hearing from you and your legislators are hearing from you, that makes a big difference in what agricultural policy looks like at the state level as well as at the federal level.
Great. Democracy in action. Well, Cathy Day, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and thank you for the vital work that you do.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I'm glad to be here.